is going to be, it's Sunday afternoon, but this is going to be this is going to act as the Tuesday lecture, the upcoming, this upcoming Tuesday, the 24th. It's going to be the lecture for image theory. And we're going to continue, we're going to finish up our introduction to early photography and the innovations of early photography. And then we're going to get into Sontag, who, like Berger, has an analysis of photography that kind of adds to what Berger has already said. But she really wants to get into the ways in which photography changed the world on a lot of different levels. And we had talked about this. We brought up McLuhan, like every new media innovation will kind of be a game changer of all aspects of society. And she wants to talk, and she ultimately wants to talk about the different new phenomena that spring up due to photography. The new kinds of social relations that spring up, the new ways in which we think about history, the ways in which we think about recreation and even things like nation, things like family. All of this will be changed due to photography. But before that, I want to just really quickly talk about the elephant in the living room that I feel I would be remiss not to address. Like many of you, I have been attempting to keep abreast as to the spread of this pandemic and the safeguards being put in place and the ways that it is affecting us economically, the ways that it is affecting us socially, psychologically, and attempting, just like you, attempting to come to terms with this. And I believe that within these lectures I will be, attempting. I think that we've already laid a foundation to start to understand why perhaps this pandemic that has been framed by many as a bolt from the blue, a kind of act of God, a rain of locusts, how in lieu of what we know about the economic corporate elite and how they operate, how we can make a case that this particular pandemic was inevitable, that certain people within certain halls of power kind of knew it and dropped the ball in terms of our infrastructural preparedness for it. There was a well-known French philosopher by the name of Michel Serres. There's a lot of Michels. I seem to have a thing for the French. Michel Serres, a cultural critic and great philosopher who, in fact, just died in June. He just passed in June. Michel Serres, it's Serres, who still has a website that I'm sure is maintained by many of his academic colleagues. And there was an article that was just posted the other day by an epidemiologist trying to come to terms with the ways in which our current global situation was the perfect storm for not only the contagion, but for the spread of the contagion and the ways. And he kind of gives us an opening thesis concerning why this is happening. All right. One of the things that is important to understand in this, and he brings it out, is the role that China has in this particular drama, and he connects it to the rise of China as an economic superpower and the ways in which Chinese economic practices and cultural practices were kind of are kind of looking the other way in terms of corporate and mercantile restrictions, became a kind of perfect storm for this particular kind of retrovirus. And it's not the first it's not the first retrovirus to start in China. You know, we have to understand that it's very similar to the SARS virus. And just to quote him, he says, and for us researchers, the intriguing question of why is China the main trigger of viral epidemics? He says, let's start with China. The country brings together all the factors likely to fuel epidemic processes: cultural, food, economic, political, demographic. In a short period of time, China has gone from the Cultural Revolution, which was kind of a mini industrial revolution for them back in Maoist China, to what they've become, you know, within the 21st century, which is like, if not the fastest rising economy, one of the top three dominant economies in the world. And how they got there in so quick a time is instructive. In a short period of time, China has gone from the Cultural Revolution to the Industrial Capitalist Digital Revolution, at a time when China is positioning itself in the race for a world order. He talks about this idea, the web of Silk Roads, all right? The Silk Road was a term that China had started to be applied to China around the time of the rise of the mercantile class during the Renaissance. That silk was, they basically built their entire economic empire on silk and spices and things like this. And there were trade routes that were established in order to transport and trade with China. So the writer, whose name is Lone Negruchu, is using the Silk Road as a metaphor for this vast octopus-like network of logistics that allows China to get all their stuff out there, all right? This huge economic, technological infrastructure that allowed, that was a route for their global economic dominance and trade. And it's that very same route he is purporting that is the cause of the rapidity and the virulence of how it's going global. A global pandemic like this can only happen through a global infrastructure. All right. The other thing he brings up, though, is that China is notorious for, he says, concerning the second point, how would the Chinese food system, based on certain risky culinary habits and perilous traditional beliefs, be able to survive if China's economic, military, and geostrategic objectives are thwarted by the health phenomena emanating from these same food practices? China's political power is faced with a dilemma. Will it tackle head-on the systemic sources of viral contagions, and in particular, the methods of procuring and the sanitary conditions of preparation of a large number of rare and exotic plants and animals such as snakes, bats, bears, palm civet, etc., which are the components of the chains of viral transmission, and the degradation of nature in China and elsewhere, which by feedback concentrate interspecies transmissions in space. Indeed, 70% of viral pathologies in humans are of animal origin, all right? Let's break it down. What's he trying to get to? I think what he's trying to get to is best answered in a connected article written in the Japan Times about, it's called Deadly Coronavirus Finds a Breeding Ground in China's Food Markets. Shanghai and particularly Wuhan province were very, very well known for what they called open air wet markets. Wet markets being their equivalent, I guess, of Wegmans. All right, where there were these huge, flourishing wet markets where you could go and get live fish and live animals and livestock, and it lent itself to a lot of human-animal interaction and bacterial crossbreeding that was alarming to epidemiologists. And a lot of people in the World Health community said that these practices, we understand that they're cultural, we understand all this, but they're very, very unsanitary and they need to be stopped. And nothing was really done due to the fact that it was a huge component of Chinese economy, all right, especially for tourism. People would come, the well-to-do would come to the wet markets and procure all kinds of exotic, weird, multi-legged creatures to ingest, just to say that you were a cultured person and you had eaten live whatever, all right? So there's that element of it. So two different components that come together here in terms of the epidemiological origins of this thing, which are economic in origin, and also the pandemic spread of contagion, which is also based on economics and logistics and trade and doing things sometimes to make a buck without regulations and without foresight, either environmentally or in terms of the overall health of your population. And we'll talk more and more about this as time goes on, I'm sure. But to tie it back into Berger and to tie it back into the Matrix, Berger in the last chapter of the book talks about the ascendancy of this state of normality that has now been disrupted. How it's going to play out, we really don't know at this point. From the economic angle, it behooves me to play a video by a man who is one of the guys I check out every month. His name is Richard Wolff. He is a professor of economics. He has been a professor of economics, as you can see by his gray hair, for a very, very long time. He actually also teaches at my alma mater, the New School. But like all of my bad luck, he got there after I left. But he's a erudite critique. He rose to ascendancy as a major public intellectual in regards to things economic right after the '08 crash. And he's got a monthly lecture that he gives from New York. I listened to. It's called Global Economic Update. I listened to it semi-religiously. One of the students in mass media research has been assigned to read his book, Capitalism's Crisis Deepens. But I felt the need to, it runs about 8 minutes, and it came out about a week ago, but it's his assessment of the economic underpinnings of this virus. So I think it's worth us checking it out.
An Ask Prof. Wolff question from our Patreon community.
I'm going to do this.
This is Richard Wolff with a response to an Ask Prof. Wolff question from our Patreon community. This question comes from John Jarecki, and it's a really good question about the relationship between the coronavirus on the one hand and the stock market drops and gyrations on the other. John asks whether the coronavirus is the cause of all the turmoil in the markets or whether it's a convenient scapegoat. So let me get right to the nub of the question as I understand it. There are dozens, more than dozens, of reasons why the stock market is in a very dangerous place. And my view is that almost anything could set off the long overdue correction. That's the polite word that people on Wall Street use, a correction, as if the stock market has misbehaved and is now going to be corrected. This misbehavior is in fact the regular way capitalism works. For the 300 years that system has been growing and becoming dominant now over the whole world, capitalism, wherever it is settled, has had an economic downturn every 4 to 7 years. Sometimes they're long and hard and deep. Other times they're short and shallow. But they're always there. The average is 4 to 7 years. Sometimes it's a little longer, sometimes it's a little shorter. 4 to 7 is the average. In other words, this system has a built-in instability that is stunning and has been the focus of criticisms of capitalism from its beginnings. Well, the last time we had a downturn in the U.S. economy was in 2008 and 9. So we are overdue, because it's more than 4 to 7 years. It's closer to 10 years since we've been in the last one. So we're overdue. Things have gotten kind of weird in the market, and so anything could set it off. The coronavirus could be the stimulus that sets it off. The collapse of oil prices over Sunday and Monday of this week is another example. And there are many more. Any kind of health crisis, war breaking out, conflict here or there, collapse of a government. For example, the government of Lebanon is on shaky grounds. The government in Italy is on shaky grounds, and so on. The coronavirus certainly plays a role. Here suddenly is exposed the failure of a capitalist system to protect its own people. On Tuesday, March 10th, Business Insider, a mainstream financial source of news, carried an important graph. It showed that while in South Korea, up until March 8th, there had been 3,000 or 4,000 tests for the coronavirus per million of their population. In the United States, as of the same day, March 8th, the total number of tests was 5 per million. That is stunning. That is a failure of a country that has known for weeks that this is a serious problem, to be able to take the steps needed. Our pharmaceutical companies hadn't produced the tests in the quantities we need. They hadn't stored them where they would be available quickly in the quantities we need. The tests are available. German companies produced a good one that the World Health Organization says works well. Everything is there, but it doesn't work. What we need for our safety is there, but it doesn't work. But the story gets worse. Hundreds of millions of people in America, we only have 300 million, either have no health insurance, or they have a health insurance that has a deductible that people don't want to spend because it's money out of their pockets. So they don't go to a doctor when they don't feel well. They wait until they're much sicker. But right now, that could be deadly for our country. Then we have millions of people who don't work at a place with paid sick leave. So if they go to see a doctor, it costs them lost income. And so they don't go. But we need them to go. In South Korea, the government immediately declared the government will pay anyone's fees to go and get tested. Go and get tested so we know who we got, what the problem is, and how to solve it. Mr. Trump and his government haven't figured that out yet, have they? Not as of the day I'm speaking, and we're seeing everything close in America. we're so terrified, but we can't have an economic system, apparently, that works to prepare. Amazing. Amazing. The medical industrial complex, the companies that make the drugs and medications, the companies that run the hospitals, the doctors, the insurance, they can't work it out so that we have a country ready to handle this kind of a crisis. You may not be able to prevent the mutation of the gene, but you certainly can prepare for it. But if you're interested in profits first, you won't. You won't make the kits if there isn't a demand for them. You won't store the kits if there isn't a demand for them. The government won't make sure you do it because the government has been captured by the medical industrial complex long ago. So here we sit. The coronavirus exposes the failures of this economic system to keep its people safe. And you want to know what the greatest danger to the stock market is? It isn't the virus. It isn't even the oil shock. It's the thinking of the people on Wall Street as they begin to look at this virus and see the unpreparedness of the American system. They can see the universities closing down, the airlines emptying out. They can see that economic disaster is coming our way. Recession, depression, no one knows, as they never do, exactly when it will hit and how deep it will cut and how long it will last. But what we know and what the investors have figured out is an economic system overdue for a downturn, puffed up with levels of debt it cannot accommodate, has no space for a crunch, for a downturn. In other times and conditions, we could have gotten through it. This one, nobody knows. And that very fear and that very wondering holds back investors, makes them sell stocks. So it's the system, in the end, destroying itself. Capitalism no longer works for the mass of the people. If it ever did, now it is such a failure that the only real question is, how could we have tolerated this long, and how can we tolerate it another minute? This is Richard Wolff for Democracy at Work, thanking our Patreon community for the participation, the engagement, and the very good questions.
So a very well-known and very well-educated and very outspoken economist speaking in terms of the reasons why we're unprepared, the reasons why perhaps this thing has become a pandemic. You know, it begs the question. The two primary questions that need to be addressed is, was the source of it caused by unpreparedness, and was the spread of it caused by unpreparedness in an economic system that was more concerned with profits than it was with public safety. And certainly this is just the tip of the iceberg, and this is just the particular crisis that we're looking at right now. All right. So there's that. One other real quick tip. I was listening to NPR this morning with an interview with Edward Snowden, who's got a recent book out called Permanent Record. Just came out in September. For those of you who don't know who Edward Snowden was, or is rather, and do not know what Edward Snowden did, I would strongly suggest that you jump onto Netflix, you jump onto Hulu, or wherever you can find it, and find the documentary called Citizen 4 that basically documents his whistleblowing on the National Security Agency and its collusions with illegal data collection and illegal surveillance, and the ways in which the American government was in collusion with this, and the price that Snowden paid. The price that Snowden paid, being exiled. Last I knew, he was exiled in Russia. He was considered an enemy of the state. They've attempted to extradite him numerous times. But he's got a new book out that's definitely worth checking out. It says in 2013, 29-year-old Edward Snowden shocked the world when he broke with the American intelligence establishment and revealed that the United States government was secretly pursuing means to collect every single phone call, text message, and email. The results would be an unprecedented system of mass surveillance with the ability to pry into the private lives of every person on Earth. 6 years later, Snowden reveals for the very first time how he helped to build this system and why he was moved to expose it. Definitely should, as you're holed up in your respective containment bunkers, definitely worth perhaps getting a Kindle copy, or if you're afraid of any packages being delivered to you, you can just read it online. Definitely worth checking out. So that's my kind of rant today. I'm a little bit disjointed, and I apologize for that. Want to get back into photography. Want to get back into the early days of photography. We were talking about how the invention of it, the different technological devices and inventions that needed to come together in order to make photography happen. Once that starts in the middle of the 19th century, photography proliferates very, very quickly. But nobody really knows what to do with it yet. In the beginning, like any other kind of technological media innovation, most of the serious staid community of whatever epoch this new thing springs up tends to look at it as a novelty, look at it as being not as important as it was. The same thing happened with film. The same thing happened with all kinds of different media. No one really knew what purposes it would ultimately end up serving. All right. Then light bulbs started going on in a lot of different areas of society. Every place from science to history to archaeology to journalism started to see the potential of being able to take photos. All right. The judicial system, the legislative system. Susan Sontag will talk about all of the different, she'll kind of turn the dome, the geodesic sphere around, looking at all the different facets of all the different ways in which photography affected society. All right? We need to take into effect when we get into Sontag that she was writing in 1977. All right, she puts together a very the essay that you've been assigned came out in a book called On Photography. It's an excerpt. It's an essay from that book. The book is published in 1977, before the proliferation of before even the invention of digital photography to any extent. All right, and once again, as we did with Berger, we have to ask of Sontag and her observations, which ones still hold up, which ones don't, and are they still applicable, or are they even more applicable now than they ever were? But just to get back, the scientific community immediately started to see the potential of photography. One of the one of those modalities was to document stuff, to be able to code and document and archive different things. The U.S. Geological Survey here in Great Britain, there was the Royal Geographical Society. They saw a way here, and in every civilization, there are vanishing monuments. Things that just are eroding over time, and they felt that all these priceless relics, not only that, but natural resources, the great vistas of nature. That everybody was, realistic and of the belief that these things wouldn't be around forever, and that we needed to have some kind of record of them. This is a photo taken by John Beasley Green, Temple of Maharaka, Nubia, Egypt, 1854. By the 1850s and 1860s, during this period, documentary photography does just that. It documents and archives historic and natural phenomena for scientific purposes. Not only that, but later on we'll find once we start talking about motion pictures, the ways in which film and photography would be an important and increasingly important tool in studying zoology, ecology, environment, all that stuff. The movement, the ways in which, the mechanics of how do birds fly, how do bees fly. It's like these were things that were made increasingly more transparent due to high-speed photography and photography. So there's this documentary function that goes on. Matthew Brady was a major photographer of the Civil War. I was of the opinion that the Civil War was the first war to ever be actually photographed, and Bongiorno was corrected after doing some reading. It was actually the Crimean War that was the first war to be photographed. Just like the general assumption that Abraham Lincoln was the first president photographed. That's not true. It was actually James Polk. James Polk was the first president to be photographed. So, but Brady was the first really well-known photographer of the atrocities of war. That we hadn't, the only representations we had before that, remember, was painting. But, here we had an opportunity, and this is where photography's activist and social justice and journalistic dimension starts to open up, all right? We start to find that photography is a way to sway political opinion, sway hearts and minds, sway people towards this particular cause or towards that particular cause, or away from this particular situation and towards this one. The persuasive and oftentimes coercive power of photography, all right, that would be no less coercive and persuasive than the different modalities of that John Berger would find in classical art. It gets even more. It gets even more powerful in those different dimensions. Brady was often criticized too for staging things. He may have been like the first proliferator of fake news. He would sometimes, in order to get a better composition, he would reposition soldiers or make them look a certain way. And Sontag will talk all about that. All right. So with the emergence of photography, we already have problems, in terms of verisimilitude, because photos, and Bazan writes about this a lot, photos for a lot of people were the exemplar, sign quote, like the absolute truth. It's like if you got pictures of it, then it had to have happened. And that is the general belief that one takes up with photography, all right, or at least initially with chemical photography. And we'll talk about how it positioned itself as being this unassailable evidence of truth, all right, and how that is now being contested, its truth value as representing the real. Timothy O'Sullivan was another great. He went out into the old American West and took these gorgeous pictures long before Ansel Adams of what was the American frontier. You know, a frontier that a lot of people felt would ultimately vanish in lieu of industrialism and the proliferation of cities, and they were right in a lot of ways. A New York newspaper man by the name of Jacob Riis comes on the scene around the turn of the century. Working for a New York newspaper, you got to remember that around the turn of the century, we are seeing it's basically 1900 is the age of immigration, the age of the immigrant. Thousands, hundreds of thousands of immigrants coming through Ellis Island and coming to resettle here. Basically, refugees, immigrants that we welcome at that time welcomed into this country. Things would change a little bit later on in terms of how we regarded the immigrant, but you know, the immigrants that flowed in and lived, a lot of them just eked out an existence even back then. I mean, it was tough times. The bottom half of Manhattan was the garment district, the factory district. This is where Italian, Polish, Russian immigrants, primarily Western European immigrants, found work. And at the same time, there was a lot of poverty still. There was a lot of crime going on. And Jacob Riis started taking pictures of that. To make people aware of what was going on, because it wasn't enough. It's like there was a persuasiveness to photos that was more powerful than just writing about something, right? Hence the evolution of newspapers, including not just illustrations, because for a long time newspapers just Hold on a minute. Newspapers just included text and illustrations because there were no photos yet. Then photos came on the scene, and photos became this huge component of journalism. In fact, the term photojournalism would be invented. And writers and newspapers realized that people wanted to see things. They wanted to see far off places, you know, and in a lot of ways it's like, you know, what Berger says about photography changing the nature of time and space is very true, right? It brings things from the other side. It makes the world smaller. It makes the world a lot smaller. But Jacob Riis was kind of a reformer and a journalist, and he worked for a New York newspaper, so he took it upon himself to go down and start documenting. And it was very, very clear, like the upper classes lived up in the upper west and east side of Manhattan. Those people were well-to-do. They had no reason to go down to the south side of like the Soho district and the garment districts, where all this was going on, where things were rat-infested, where people were living like, you know, 20 people in a shoebox, and sanitary conditions and disease and the spread of things like smallpox and polio and all that. And Jacob Riis went down there and was like taking pictures and came back to these people uptown and said, look, this is how these people are living. you know, and he would compile them in a book called How the Other Half Lives. It was published in 1890. So we start to see the social activist dimension of photography start up. And the government itself, the United States government and other governments itself, would start to see the power of using photography to basically promote certain social and economic programs that they needed. They understood the ways in which powerful photographs could win over hearts and minds to, for instance, some type of new social program, some type of new farm aid program, things like the Tennessee Valley Authority, photos. They had to sell people on the entry into wars, you know, and photos were a primary way of getting information out there. There was also a situation during this whole time of, this was around 1935, and those of you that know any history know that was concurrent with the Depression. All right, Depression happens in 1929. All right, FDR, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, will access all of this government capital to create jobs, create civic projects, and put people back to work. Because not unlike our own time, by 1929, 1930, half of this country's workforce was like unemployed. All right, and people were going through, God forgive me for saying it, people were going through kind of what we are going through and are going to go through now. What FDR did is saw it as being a very, very urgent situation, and he put together this economic program that put 1 million people immediately back to work. He put together the Civilian Conservation Corps. All different kinds of dams and infrastructural projects were financed, and people were put back to work, including artists and photographers in this program called the WPA, or the Works Progress Authority. All right, because we were still living within a cultural milieu in this country where we still put a lot of stock in culture and the arts, you know, to the point where we were willing to subsidize them. But not only that, I mean, it certainly wasn't their goals were not as necessarily as pure as the driven snow. There were underlying agendas to a lot of this stuff. But some of the great WPA photographers would become some of the greatest photographers of all time. Dorothea Lange and Walker Evans would go out into Middle America and document the plight of farmers in the Dust Bowl, document the plight of miners and sharecroppers, and really build a kind of case for American economic renewal. And Sontag will talk about this too. Here's some other pictures from Dorothea Lange, shanty towns, you know, during the Depression, the way that people were living. And these were like Exhibit A, and getting people to recognize the plight of other people. You know, if one of the positive attributes of photography is it builds empathy with people. All right, and Susan Sontag will start to talk about the ways that it brings us together, and the ways that photography keeps us apart too. Photography is written in 1977, it's like I said. So, you know, we need to read it in that context. We have to understand that photography is still in a state where the best you can get in terms of instantaneousness is you had like Kodak like instant cameras where you could like push the button and it would like you could buy a cartridge of like 12 or 24 exposures and you could get a photo that would develop within like 5 to 10 minutes. But that was about as instantaneous as it was. For the most part, you know, taking photos in no way bore any resemblance to the instantaneous nature of digital photography. You would go to the camera store, you'd go to the Five and Dime, or you'd go to the drugstore and you'd pick up a roll of film, you'd put the film in the camera, you'd take your pictures of your wedding or your trip to Lake George or wherever you were going, and then you had to send them back or take them to a place that would develop them. And for a long period of time, it took a couple, 3 days. Then it got faster and faster, you know, to the point by like the late 70s, you could drop off a roll of film. There used to be like all these little, they're almost like they were almost like bank drive-throughs. There were like these little photo mats where you could drive up, you would drop your roll of film off, and you could come back, come back at 5 o'clock, and they would have your prints. Usually you'd get double prints. But that was about the level of instantaneity that you had at that time, all right? There wasn't this, like had it on demand thing. It was still this chemical process, you know, that needed to be, you know, strips of negative film needed to be developed, you know, and there was a wait, all right? The article is called In Plato's Cave, and we've already talked about the parable, the myth of Plato's cave, and what it entails, and the fact that it's an allegory of man's position in terms of knowing reality, how we know reality, or what is hidden from us. It becomes an allegory that will continue to stay we applied it to the Matrix. It was an allegory that the Matrix plays upon. You know, that basically proposes the question: is the reality that I live is it true? Is it factual, or are we living in some realm of shadows where there might be something else going on behind it that we are unbeknownst to us? All right. The first thing she wants to talk about is the proliferate. Once this thing gets off the ground, once photography becomes a big thing, the first thing she wants to talk about is this phenomena of how pervasive. I want to use the word pandemic, but I'm going to pretend I didn't say that. How pervasive, and there's like this explosion of people using photographs, and photographs. You know, for most of human history, there's no such thing. Within 30, 40 years, it's like there's photos everywhere. There's people taking photos, hobbyists and families, and photos and journals and magazines, and that she was aware of this like sheer mass of images that we were generating, and she wants to pose the question: what is the motive? What is the drive? What is the compulsion for us to take pictures? All right, and she'll kind of analyze it along. It serves a lot of different functions, is what we'll ultimately find out. You know, both good and bad. And she says here, the insatiability of the photographing eye changes the terms of confinement in the cave, our world, and teaching us a new visual code. Photographs alter and enlarge our notions of what is worth looking at and what we have a right to observe. They are a grammar and, even more importantly, an ethics of seeing. Finally, the most grandiose result of the photographic enterprise is to give us the sense that we can hold the whole world in our heads as an anthology of images. There's a lot going on here. All right. Teaching us a new visual code. Teaching us it's photography is built with a series of different conventions of what's worth photographing, what's not worth photographing, how we use it, and it retrains our perception in terms of we start looking at things like what would make a good photograph and what wouldn't, and it changes our sense of aesthetics and composition and all that. There's a grammar and, even more importantly, an ethics of seeing. She wants to talk about the ethics of photography too, in terms of its relationship to people and their privacy and their consent to be photographed or not be photographed, the ethical dimensions of photojournalism, in terms of documenting certain kinds of atrocities, and even today we're still in the midst of this tug of war between and more than ever, what constitutes privacy, what constitutes your own personal space, what can and cannot be. There's this whole taboo against, for instance, on YouTube about photographing minors without signed consent. So there's all these ethical dimensions to pictures that have always kind of been there. But at the same time, with this proliferation of Instagram and YouTube and all these other social media modalities, some of those ethics have been kind of tossed aside, in lieu of this kind of compulsion to take pictures, But she says that one of the compulsions it feeds is this kind of acquisitive, it's acquisitive. It wants to capture the world. It looks at the world not unlike what Berger says about the way in which the world is framed as objects for us to have and possess. There's a kind of possessive, acquisitive, almost greedy kind of insatiability to taking photographs. It's like, once I've taken a photograph, I go to the Eiffel Tower, it's like, I got a photograph of the Eiffel Tower. There was this sense of that, of the collector and the connoisseur, that wasn't unlike, for instance, like collecting baseball cards. Baseball cards, don't know if you remember them, but they were a very, very big thing. Kids would have these collections of baseball cards, which were essentially photos of all the current players on a Major League Baseball roster, and they would trade them and hoard them and envy the other guy's collection, and that kind of competitiveness with baseball. And nowadays it's like big business. You got a Babe Ruth, you got like a Tom Seaver rookie card. You can, and it's in mint condition. You might be able to retire on it. But she says that this is true of photographs in general. She makes a reference to a Godard film. Jean-Luc Godard, the famous French filmmaker from the 50s and 60s, his first film is considered one of the 100 best films of all. It's always on like the 100 best films of all time. It was called Les Bouts Soufflés. The American translation was Breathless. He would go on. Sorry if this is loud. I gotta try. I started at a stupid time today, and I'm trying to stay within the hour and 15-minute time limit. The film was called Les Carabiniers, translates as The Riflemen, and she talks about it. And in the film, she says, in Godard's Les Carabiniers, two sluggish peasants are lured into joining the king's army by the promise that they'll be able to loot, rape, kill, or do whatever else they please to the enemy and get rich. But the suitcase of booty
that Michelle and Ulysses triumphantly bring home years later to their wives turns out to contain only picture postcards, hundreds of them, of monuments, department stores, mammals, wonders of nature, etc. And Godard's gag, she says, vividly parodies the equivocal magic of the photographic image. Photographs are perhaps the most mysterious of all objects. They make up and thicken the environment we recognize as modern. So she's talking about, in this film, they come home, and their wives are standing, with bated breath, waiting to see all the golden loot they come back with. And all they come back with are photos, postcards, and Godard is making a gag, an allegory on the nature of objects, the nature of representation, and what we take for being real. She goes on, and she fleshes out this what we're doing when we're taking photos. To photograph is to appropriate the thing, she says. To photograph is to appropriate the thing photographed. It means putting oneself into a certain relation to the world that feels like knowledge. I'm putting the emphasis on feels like knowledge, because later on in the essay, she'll question whether the knowledge content, the facticity, the nature of that photographic knowledge, and whether it's true knowledge or not. A certain relation to the world that feels like knowledge, and therefore it feels like power, right? Then when we take a picture, what she's attempting to say is like, when we take a picture of something, it's very, we go back to the magical origins of representation. Remember, we were talking about Paleolithic and Neolithic man, with these rites of, building a, when the tribe was starving, you paint a bear with a arrow through it in the hopes that with this kind of magical thinking, it would be propitious for the hunt. If I picture it, I could make it so. It's that kind of magical thinking that still sits at the core of our belief system about photography and having power over stuff. Photographed images do not seem to be statements about the world so much as pieces of it. Pieces of the world, not necessarily statements about the world. Although in our other class, where we're going over rhetoric, there will be different arguments about how photographs are a statement. She's saying they're not. Miniatures of reality that anyone can acquire. And she'll talk that anyone can acquire. And she'll talk, not unlike Berger, about the democratizing influence of photography. How now everybody can have a facsimile of a Rembrandt hanging on their living room wall. How everybody can go to the Louvre without having to pay $750 to get there. How everybody can have all these different representations of art and go places. There's a democratizing dimension to all this that Berger even talks about. So we've already been up this road. She talks about, and here's like, by the mid-70s, the cliche of the Japanese tourist, not to ruffle anybody's cultural heritage, but there was this, and it gets parodied in films throughout the 70s, of the Japanese tourist running around with a camera, and this whole idea of like packaging the world, right? That she says that photography, in a sense, it's a way of trying to gain control over things that we might not necessarily have control over. And it does this in a lot of sociological and psychological ways. She says it's very important to realize that photographs in a book
are a lot different than, for instance, just photographs standing alone. That anytime we put photographs in a sequence that is forced upon them in some kind of artificial way, it changes their meaning. And even Berger was talking about that when in the last chapter, in the last episode, he was showing magazines with jet set couples trying to sell cigars or liquor, juxtaposed right next to refugees from Pakistan, and it's the and the context, the ways in which photos are sequenced, has a lot to do with their meaning content. And we'll talk a lot more about that when it comes to film and editing and the process of association, right? And she brings up a film by the French director Chris Marker called Four Camels, where it's a film. Chris Marker was a very, very famous French, once again the French, experimental filmmaker who did a famous film called Le Jet, but he also did this film in which he shows photos in a certain order, and it's a commentary on the ways in which one medium can kind of enforce its dynamics on another. That you're kind of, unlike just going through a box of photographs, he's showing you photos and you're kind of forced to watch a photo for a certain period of time, and then he goes on to another one. And she talks about the contextual nature of like how we view photos, when depending on the context, depending on the medium. She goes on. What other function does it start to serve in society? What other thing does it start? It starts furnishing evidence, right? Photographs furnish evidence. Something we hear about, no doubt, seems proven when we're shown a photograph of it. In one version of its utility, the camera record incriminates, starting with their use by the Paris police in the murderous roundups of the communards in June 1871. Photographs became a useful tool of modern states in the surveillance and control of their increasingly mobile populations. In another version of its utility, the camera record justifies. A photograph passes for incontrovertible proof that a given thing happened. You got to think about all the crime shows, and especially it's like CSI, NCIS, all these. But even before that, all the old shows, shows about law and shows about law enforcement and the police, and going into courtrooms and providing evidence, and how prominent photos acted as proof. If you were a private investigator, you'd go out and you'd get paid. My wife is having an affair, and the guy would come back with pictures of the wife leaving a hotel. Oh, I guess it happened. This like incontrovertible nature of the photograph at the time. And it's still with us, folks. It's still, if it happened on film, if it happened on photo, it's like, I'll give you an anecdote, which is rather unpleasant. Buongiorno, a couple months ago, went to New York City on an errand with a friend, and she was driving, and we went and did what we had to do, but we were looking for a place in Brooklyn, and we were having a hard time. We were asking for directions and blah, blah, blah. When we get home, and 4 weeks later, Buongiorno and said accomplice gets a ticket in the mail with a photo of the car in a bus lane and with a fine. And they're like, here you are. Please pay us $50, all right? This is a month later, folks. They got it on photo. One of those street surveillance cameras caught it. And I looked at it, and she's like, well, I think we should pay her, right? I was like, just fuck that. I was like, I wanted to like contest it like through and through. As you know, I probably would. Ultimately, we ended up just like splitting the ticket. But the whole idea of being issued a ticket, there's no officer, you're not getting pulled over. The whole case is predicated on this blurry picture where this image recognition sees your license plate and boom, it's like, and that's the way it goes. So I mean, that hasn't gone away. That certainly hasn't gone away. 10 more minutes left. So we're done at 5:10. So there's this idea of evidence, this idea of photography and photographs entering the realm of jurisprudence and crime and punishment and what constitutes evidence. There's all that. This is a photograph by Alfred Stieglitz, who is considered one of the greatest photographers of all time, from Grand Central Terminal. The play of light here is virtuoso, definitely a virtuosic, whatever the word would be for that. She says something very interesting at this point on page 6. She says, while a painting or prose description can never be other than a narrowly selective interpretation, a photograph can be treated as a narrowly selective transparency. What is she saying? We'll talk about this later, but when I paint something, when I write something, when I describe, if I get a pen and paper, and I could sit here all day long trying to describe this room, all right? Or I can sit here with an easel and some oil paints and work for days, if not weeks, attempting to, get a photorealistic painting of this room, right? But it's always going to be framed as an interpretation. Does it give me that? Does the description and language give me the thing itself? No, and nobody would argue that it does. Does the painting give me the thing itself? No, and nobody would argue that it does. Does the photo give me the thing? She says, for most people, the answer would be yeah. The photo, but she'll go to the point of saying no. Once again, even with photographs, it's a question of an interpretation, depending on lighting, depending on camera angle, depending on whether I use a soft lens, depending on the subject, depending on the overall conventions in the society, right? What's normal, what's beautiful, what's not, what's funny, what's not. All of those things fall into a photo and what it represents. But despite the assumption of veracity, despite the assumption of this is true, I got it in my hand, I got the picture of it, that gives all photographs authority, interest, seductiveness, the work that photographers do is no generic exception to the usual shady commerce between art and truth. Even when photographers are most concerned with mirroring reality, even when I'm most concerned with trying to get exactly what's there, no more or no less, I'm always haunted by choices that I am making and framing my subject and encapsulating that reality. The photo is not, and ultimately what is she saying? The photo's not the reality, all right? They exist. Same thing with painting, same thing with theater, same thing with sculpture. It's always a representation of something else, all right? Famous photo by Dorothea Lange of a sharecropper's wife. I can't remember the name of it. Now it's become a seminal. But, you can understand how, and it's like certainly, she's attempting to, not necessarily give us reality, but elicit some kind of emotion out of us, of compassion or pity or sympathy, depending on
the way the person's framed. The choice of the subject matter is there's the choice of the subject matter, and it's what you do with it. That ultimately lends itself to looking at it in a certain way due to cultural conventions and codes. We'll talk more about that. Recently, photography, now she's talking in 1977, don't forget. Recently, photography has become almost as widely practiced in amusement as sex and dancing, which means that, like every mass art form, photography is not practiced by most people as an art. And it's not. Most people, and especially is it as true as ever nowadays? Yeah. It's like most people posting on Instagram or walking around and taking pictures of everything under the sun are not the same type of people. 90% of the people out there taking pictures within that milieu are not the same kind of people that are signing up for Tara Monaco's class or Richard's class and going out and taking pictures. And they're not the same as the ones that we saw over in the gallery over at the library. Most people are not concerned. It's like it's not serving that purpose for most people. What purpose is it serving? We'll see. Which means that, like every mass art form, photography is not practiced by most people as an art. It is mainly a social right, a defense against anxiety, and a tool of power. She'll pick that apart. Then she goes on to page 9. A photograph gives people an imaginary possession of a past that is unreal. They also help people to take possession of a space in which they are insecure. Let's repeat it. A photograph gives people an imaginary possession of a past that is unreal. They also help people take possession of a space in which they are insecure. And this has to do with the idea that irregardless of whether I have a photograph of something, and it has to do with the nature of memory and the nature of time, and the fact, I can look all day through a photo book of my brothers and sisters and me at Disneyland or Lake George or at Wildwood, New Jersey, and look at it and have some inkling that I was there, that this event occurred. But by the very, very nature of time, there is like this disconnect. There's this lingering disconnect about having that experience and how that experience is gone and irretrievable, and what I have in front of me, and the disconnect. And it's not a question of, well, did this really happen? Like in Blade Runner, in the movie Blade Runner, there are these like androids that are given fake memories that never existed, right? This whole past to give them stability, right? And this one android, Rachel, who's like the love interest, has these pictures of her mom, and the detective, the human detective that falls in love with her is saying, listen, it's like those aren't real. They're just it's like we're not going that far. But in that scene, there is a kind of commentary on this disjunction between our memories and our nostalgia and what really happened, and what really happened in our lives. It's like, for instance, it's like, when my parents being passed, I'll look at pictures of them and miss them and think of them fondly, and all that, and it elicits those kind of emotions. It doesn't elicit the emotions of like the time my mother smacked me with a wooden spoon or threw a shoe at me because I did something wrong, or grounded me for a month. It's not there for that. It's like that was a reality too. But I'm not thinking about that reality when I'm looking at a family picture as a memento. It serves another psychological purpose of nostalgia, of empathy, and we'll talk more about that next time. but we got to call it a day.
By the way, and I'm going to send this out as an email too. I need to talk about this really quickly. Due to the changing nature of things on campus, the library is going to be closed down. Your 2-page papers that you handed in 2 weeks ago, I know, please don't kill me with this. My whole plan was going to be to correct them and scan them and send them back to you. I am not going to have access to a scanner. What I'm going to need, just get easy, don't go don't come to my house to beat me up. What I'm going to need from people, if at all possible, is for you to resend the paper as an electronic document so that I can use a totally new software that I did not want to get into in order to correct it. It's called tracking changes, and Ed Evans was telling me about it. If you can send it to me like that, I can send it back to you as an electronically corrected paper. If you can't do that, worst case scenario would be that I read the paper, I correct it, and I just send you back, a critique of it, like a paragraph, like maybe you should have done this, maybe you should, without all the grammatical things. But if at all possible, please send it back to me as a Word doc. Thanks.